The creation of Adam, I am always saying that this is not a literal creation. This is not a literal creation. We can know that it's not a literal creation, and we will now at this time. I have a brief presentation here for you concerning the creation of man, and it does not originate with the Hebrew folks. It actually originates with Egypt. It originates with the god Khnum, whom we are going to discover, and this image perfectly relays just what that creation is. This is the god there, Khnum, creating man on, and you wouldn't be surprised to know, a potter's wheel. The creation of man from a potter's wheel. Imagery that if we know the book of Jeremiah, if we know how things work from Genesis to Malachi concerning the deity therein, they are a potter and they form on their potter's table, and they do not form humans on their potter's table from Genesis to Malachi, as we find in the Egyptian mythology, because it is not humans that the deity from Genesis to Malachi is concerned with creating or acting for or on behalf of in a general sense. We're going to look at this. We're going to look at the Egyptian mythology concerning Khnum. This is the god that is associated to creating man from the dust of the ground. Khnum is. This has been transferred over into Genesis 2, into the narrative therein. It has nothing to do with the deity from Genesis to Malachi. Only the figurative illustration is used from Egyptian mythology. We're going to look at this in this presentation, and then I'm going to briefly, because I have in videos prior, if you have not seen those, check those out, explored this metaphorical or allegorical concept that the Bible purges and the authors purge from its linguistic, philosophical context concerning the creation in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 7 and what that is. It is not humans, has nothing to do with humans. It will never have anything to do with humans. We're going to see this. Very interesting. So that brief intro to this presentation of just challenging, because that's what I want to do here, because I'm always saying that the creation story of Adam in Genesis 2 is not real. I'm going to challenge that. I'm going to act like it is real. I want to act like it is real. I want to pretend like it is the real thing. And in this presentation, I'm going to just go through and show the origin source of where we get our, in 2025, perception from, according to the Christian theory, of where to associate the imagery, the language, the lingo, the feeling, the vibe within Genesis 2 and 7, where we get that from. And so I want to just highlight how the Jewish slash Christian story as not being unique. It's number one. It's not unique. It's taken, it's revamped, and it has been revamped over time, beginning with the Egyptian religion. And eventually, as we go forward, we're going to show how this investigation of culture should help us to further define the landscape of what we hope to believe, and also what we believe, and also where we think our belief should be thereafter. Now, Khnum, worshipped primarily at Esna, today known as Esna, back then Elephantine, revered as the master potter god who fashioned all humans and gods on his potter's wheel. From Roman Egypt and onward, prior to that, the Hellenization of Egypt maintained this god and he transformed into different versions all throughout time, which is why it's no surprise that the version of this deity has found its way into and it was Hellenistic Judaism that actually coined the man being created by a deity from that dust of the ground. Hellenistic Judaism gave that to us because that's Greek. And that sort of Greek ideology, it mingles inside of this Egyptian ideology of the god Khnum creating man from the dust of the ground on his potter, giving it a special physical, mental, spiritual significance to the individual that is then going to read these things, because they know that this is not real. The Egyptians know that there is no god called Khnum that formed man, humanity on their potter's wheel. It wasn't about that back then. We're going to see more of that as this presentation goes on. But there was a festival for this god and for the creation of humanity on the potter's wheel that took place in Egypt. And this festival, it is in reference to the reverence that is needed for the sustenance and the maintenance of life that this God has of over. So when we see this God doing their work, it's the same thing as when we hear now in the Christian theory or in the Jewish theory of God forming man from the dust of the ground, the same sort of personal aspect that we associate there. It's the same sort of personal aspect that is then there. Only difference is the breath that came into the human's life after Khnum created them was the goddess Heket. She was the breath of life that entered into humanity and gave humanity life after being formed from the dust of the ground, from clay, on the potter's wheel. And so they had this God reserved in a special, specific temple just for the preservation of the memory of the connection that humans have to their environment, because that's what this God meant to them. Philosophically, linguistically, contextually, culturally, it represented the aspect of humans dawning in an existence of which it doesn't really seem like they should, and yet they are here. And they are here diverse from nature in a specific way, yet still intertwined with it, meaning that the human is created in a very special way. And in such a special way, only something great could have formed the human into the way that it is. And so here we have this God here forming the human into something special, because the human is in an environment of which it just doesn't make sense for it to be in, knowing what is within the human, yet clogged and bogged down by some vehicle that it is attached to, guiding its journey while not at the same time guiding its journey. So you have this God here, then you have Heket given the breath of life, the symbol for the breath of life, the symbol for the goddess Heket is what is called their Ankh, and the Ankh is basically the Christian cross, but with a circle on top of it. So all of these things and symbols, they're already in existence. It's just that by the time you get to 2025, the Christian theory has absorbed so much of everything, these things really just don't matter. So you go to Genesis 2 now in the account, and I'm going to look at this in a very simple way before I get into the concrete philosophical aspect of it. In a simplistic way, when we're reading this, and if we're only just reading this, we are hearing of a deity forming mankind from the dust, the first from the dust in a way that is very personal because it's with their hands and it's with their personal breath that is going into this. So this creation is a very, very personal creation. This is something that is, one can say, filled or seen or observed with having a lot of love within it. And not simply just love. This isn't just a carnal form of love. There is a high, elevated kind of love that we find in this creation of man because God Himself has somehow breathed His breath into this inanimate, known object to Him to make Him an animate, no longer object, but an eye of affection and the apple of the eye of affection for the deity. And so when we're hearing of this act, we're hearing something intimate, we're hearing something personal, we're hearing a personal, intimate origin that is from some supposed divine hands, a craftsmanship that then allows the verification of the belief in that deity to be the only one to be recognized. So the figurative illustration there plays a central role in the worship that is to come thereafter, allowing the individual to feel and get a sense that they are so important that it was necessary that the deity himself form them, and not simply form them, animate them with life from him. So they are not just walking around as dust, they are also walking around with an encoded DNA that is divine. That makes the human special. That makes the human beloved. That puts the human at the center of everything, including the center of a nature that also has and shares so much love within it from that same creator, from that same fashioner, from that same quote unquote founder. So this makes creation unique. This makes the individual unique, not the verse itself, how the verse is looked at when you're simply just going on the surface and you're not knowing the origin of anything. It's just that's how it's looking on the surface. And on the surface, it's looking like it is an account of affection. It is an account of life, of transforming, of resurrection, of regenerating, and in a way that is special, that is intimate, and that binds and bonds humanity to the one that formed them when we're looking at it in this way. Now, there is a shared connection between this Genesis 2:7, of course, and the myth that is connected to Khnum creating humanity and gods also from their potter's wheel. And the connection there shows a philosophical and cultural link in ideology. Now, the ancient Near East was a melting pot of cultures and religious ideas generating interactions between Egypt, Israel, and neighboring civilizations, which ultimately would influence the development of such thoughts as we find in the book of Genesis, Genesis 2:7. Both Khnum and the God of Israel, they're associated with the themes of creation along with life-giving, life-sustaining, life-imparting. Again, these shared motifs, they're not accidental. The imagery here that is used is not accidental. We don't know where this imagery comes from. We think this imagery comes from out of nowhere and that it is a sort of revelation. It's not. Sort of in the similar vein as I went through the Hellenistic Judaism's Tobit and the question posed by the to the Jesus character by the Sadducees and by the then Sanhedrin of the woman that had seven husbands and then died and so on. We think these things are original, but they're not. We don't know the origin when we're stepping into them, but there is a cultural transferable theme and motif that follows all of this and has an origin source. And this source of origin connected to a pantheon of deities and a pantheon of deities that have stories attached to them. And the Bible is an interesting thing because the Bible does its best to take every story that is within every known culture, every known linguistic, philosophical, implied religious culture, and the Bible uses that not in a literal sense, but to emphasize its the finality of its main point. So it's taking and bridging gaps between what is mythological, what it deems worthy of entering into a philosophical sense through mythology, and then also the point of the two of those bridging together. The Bible is a work of art. It's bridging themes to get a philosophical point across. It's never meant, nothing in there to be taken literal. They're using history, sure, there are historical elements in there. The authors are historical fiction writers. They're going to place some historical things in there, but the fiction is going to outweigh the history, and then the history is going to seem to be fictional. So when you're reading it, you have to really be careful about origins, about source, about what the intention for you, your own self, reading this is. Because if the intention that you do not have, if it is not personal, personally understood by you, if you do not have a personal understanding of the intention for why you are placing your eyes onto this text, it will get deviated. It's a tricky book, but the kind of literature and the art form that the authors are using, they're using a form of art that is historical fiction, yet there is truth within it, but the truth is blended with their ideology, with their time in space and in context, and with their agenda for doing so, which affects the theological implications of everything that's going on in there. And as I'm here highlighting in Genesis 2:7, There is an interplay of cultural and theological ideas from the Near East that gets carried over into the uh, opening titles of the Bible, all throughout, but it gets carried out throughout, and the authors build on these themes in their opening chapters and titles and such. They build on them throughout, and they create a unique narrative as they go on throughout the scriptures until you get to the book of Malachi. So they're using themes, they're rehearsing, they're recycling themes from previous religions, and they're doing so for a figurative illustration to demonstrate the depth of their philosophical intention within what they're doing. This takes their theological and philosophical appointment intention away from what the general reader would assume it to be. So when we are reading something in, again, example here, Genesis 2 and 7 about the creation of man, we can't just read these things because the authors didn't write them just to be read. The authors wrote them for a specific philosophical reason using prior mythological context to get to their present philosophical or theological agenda that they have for their then audience. That's very important to understand because we can't just read these things. And again, I'm always saying that the creation of Adam is not the creation of a literal man. A literal man is not on the mind of the author or of the deity that the author is scripting. We're going to see this. Now, there's a linguistic way, as I kind of just said, to really get to the point of where the logic behind all of this mythology interplay gets to. There's a cognitive thought embodied within this. There is a theory of metaphor concept. There is a theory of uh, blending concepts within this, and it all works to get a schema of a portrait that the narrative is supposed to have in a unique sense as tools, as instruments. Well, if you're reading it on that level, to be able to understand the cultural and cognitive impact of what's going on under the surface. So that's why these things are here and why the authors are giving them. They're not giving them to their reader for them to be storybooks. This isn't supposed to be storybook. You're not supposed to hear something and then walk around thinking, "Oh, this is the Son of Man," or "This is that," or "Oh, this is them," or they're not using they're not using names for their characters to represent literal people. They're not using names for churches to represent or temples to represent literal temples. They're not using anything of this sort in this literature from Genesis to Malachi to be literal. The very point of them taking and using Near Eastern mythology, Egyptian mythology, Hittite mythology, they're using all of these mythologies within their narrative and they're placing it into one, creating characters, creating locations, creating sources, and using real locations and using real history from within those locations for their imaginary characters and the train of linguistics within the narrative for the very purpose of it not being realistic at all. This is a story of origin for a specific people and a specific people tied to a specific metaphorical or allegorical, philosophical, and theological understanding about themselves. And so, embedded within all of this is a narrative of culture. And that is something that when I do study the Bible, and then when I do present anything on the Bible, this is something that I like to purge from it is a cultural underpinning, a cultural understanding of what we are reviewing. Because only then will you be able to understand the philosophical implications of what that cultural understanding is intended to get across, why it's there, why it's present, and then for us in 2025, why it's no longer around. All of these things are important. So when we're reading Genesis 2:7 and we're seeing that Lord God formed man from dust and then planted him, we have to be able to understand that these things are not, as we would say, quote unquote, inspired, or I should say, quote unquote, divinely inspired, because they are inspired. They're inspired by other authors' prescriptions that are taken to be divine. quote unquote divine, supposedly divine, they are taking them, they are articulating them, they are re-articulating them, and they are placing them into a position for their current cultural linguistic framework. They know this. And they know that what they're doing is they're highlighting a specific experience for the human being to where they can understand that they, according to how their deity or how they should believe their deity is seeing them, he is their potter. They are their clay. Both narratives, when you take the Egyptian and then you take the Hebrew, you see your deity as a potter, you see something very specific and something very special about you. You don't just see something that is slapped together and then kicked off alone. You're seeing a creation that is not alone. You're seeing a creation by a creator that is cared for, that is overseen, and that is intentionally placed here. There's a reason. There is a reason, and there is logic behind the human's existence here. And they're not alone. And the fact that they're not alone, it then further embeds culture because each and every single one of us may come from a different culture, but when we hear this thing, when we hear this story, when we hear what's going on here with the human origin, well, then there is a shared cultural application, metaphorically, for us all, uniting everyone as one. And so that's another reason why Khnum was necessary for the Egyptian folks, is because it brought unity. This deity brought unity to those people. Their deities, they weren't just deities like how we see like Greek gods or something, or how we think about gods or whatever we think. Like everything back then with these people, the Mayas and all of these folks, the deities that they had, it was all representing things that they couldn't explain by word, and things that they couldn't explain by word that they held to a higher regard because they understood from these things they themselves were held to a higher regard from the thing that they cannot see, from the one, I should say, which is better, from the one that they cannot see. So when they see themselves now and they understand the diverse nature of what is going on within them as opposed to what is going on without them, we are purposefully created, these folks thought. We are purposefully made with an intention. It was believed, and that belief symbolized through this tale of Khnum. And not only did it symbolize that we have an origin and that we are cared for and that we have a destiny, it also symbolized how fragile we are and how dependent we are on what looms greater than us. And so that also plays a part into the service of the deity to make sure that the deity is served properly, because the one that created us also has the power to destroy us. We are fragile. We don't have this on our own. Despite us having the breath of our deity within us, well, that means absolutely nothing because we are still made by clay. And once clay is gone, well, are we? Maybe there should be another deity to help us out with that afterwards. And it's another story for that. But you see the interplay there of how all of this works on the psyche of the human being and how that work on the mindset, the mind frame, the framework there, it then furthers a thought pattern of devotion, of spirituality, of integrity, of a groundedness in earth and a groundedness in what is beyond earth. And it just serves a more holistic purpose for the individual to feel connected with their experience more than anything else. But there is an allegory to all of this. The Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Man became a living soul. This isn't about literal human creation, but the formation of a denomination or priesthood. Because in linguistic philosophical context, this is all Israel's deity creates. They don't create humans. Even on their potter's wheel, they are creating houses. Dust is a symbol. The ground is a symbol. Dust represents seed, families, nations, or denominations we learn in the book of Genesis and in Isaiah. It's not physical dirt that's happening in Genesis 2:7. These are oppressed or destroyed assemblies emerging from out of chaos, just as in Jeremiah chapter 4. Jeremiah chapter 4 uses the same language that is going on in Genesis chapter 1. Something that is without form and void in Genesis chapter 4, in Jeremiah 4. And what is without form and void in in Jeremiah 4 is the same that is without form and void in the book of Genesis. Jeremiah is talking about Jerusalem. Genesis is talking about a Jerusalem. That creation narrative is not about humans. It's not about literal universe, literal galaxy. It is about what revolves around a Jerusalem. That ground is also a symbol. The ground signifies a void state post destruction, as we learn in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. The assemblies we learn in Isaiah 10, 5, and 6, they are beaten down like mire. The king of Assyria is hired in Isaiah 10 to destroy the priesthood of Jerusalem into mire. Mire is clay. Clay is to be used to form. When the assembly is beaten down like mire, they then take on a form that is shapeable. Because only when you are as clay can you be shaped, according yet and still to the Egyptian mythology of Khnum forming humanity from clay. So the authors writing these things, they are using the metaphors, the linguistics, and the implications that are found very reliable within those mythologies. And here highlighting the mythology of Khnum forming man from the clay on his potter's wheel. They are using the same mythology, the authors writing the Bible, but their philosophical reference is completely different. It is not humans that the deity of Israel cares about creating. It is priesthoods. It is priesthoods that need to be beaten down like clay, like mire, so that they can then be reformed, destroying the priesthood to resurrect the priesthood. Same practice. Out of oppression, out of the oppression of the priest, out of the priestly oppression, a new priesthood is to be resurrected. A new priesthood. It's not about humans. Genesis to Malachi. It's not about humans. Never is, never was, and especially in Genesis 2:7. Genesis 2:7 is simply relaying the same scenes that we find going on in Isaiah and Jeremiah 4 and Isaiah 10. Same scene. Same scene in Genesis 2:7, and then afterwards planted. Same scene of Israel being oppressed and then planted. Same scenes. It's not about humans, even though the mythology from Egypt there is taken. Now this creation takes place within the womb of annihilation. Isaiah talks about their deity. I should say the author writing the book of Isaiah talks about their deity having a womb, and that through this womb, Israel is given birth. Jerusalem is finally purged. Jerusalem is carried in the womb of their deity, and their deity gives birth to them. This isn't a literal womb. This is a womb of oppression. This is a womb of annihilation. This is a womb of destruction, and this is a womb for the priesthood. Always the priesthood from Genesis to Malachi. This is who their deity cares about creating. And then once that is, taking place, then we find a breath given to them. Lamentations lets us know that the breath of life of the priesthood is their king. The breath of life to the priesthood is their king. When we're seeing the illustration of God creating man from the dust, as it is in Genesis 2:7, even though the illustration is taken from Egyptian mythology, the ultimate connotation is in reference to the new life given to the priesthood. And that life given to the priesthood, according to the narrative through and through, throughout the Bible, it is always a king known as an anointed, known as a Messiah. Messiah is always a king from Genesis to Malachi. Messiah is never some poverty-laden individual from a dusty region in the Middle East. Messiah is never some mythologically breathed into logos individual doing things and healing things. No. Genesis to Malachi, the Messiah is always a king. King breathes life into the dust of that deity's people. That dust is the people. That assembly is what is to be revived, and that breath of life is always the king that gives life and breath to them, and then power for them to be planted. This is a consistent narrative from within Genesis 1 and 2, and then on throughout until the book of Malachi. So by the time you get to the book of Jeremiah 18:6 and understanding how the things work, you're going to be able to hear, "O house of Israel, cannot I do with you as this potter? As the clay is in the potter's hand, so are you in my hand, O house." This deity is a potter of houses, a potter of priesthoods. This isn't again about human beings, even though the authors have taken the mythology from Egyptian religion and applied it to their text. It's never to be taken as the Egyptians took it. It's to be taken as Hebrew linguistic, cultural, philosophical implications would have it. That's the difference, and that's why it's relevant, the imagery there for the reader, not to be taken literally, because you can't take it literally because there is no God that ever formed anyone from the dust of the ground. This originated from Egypt as myth. But what the authors of the Bible have done is they've taken myth and they've turned it into a philosophical lesson for how their deities cycle with their priesthood works. Really beautiful when you allow the philosophical culture that is attached to these things to speak. And so when we're seeing now the life that is then given, just a quick side by side here in the Egyptian tradition, the goddess Heket associated to the Ankh. The Ankh looks like the Christian theories cross, but with a circle on top of it. Life-giving breath is the central motif in Egyptian tradition. The goddess Heket imparts life via the Ankh. The breath symbolizes the intangible divine life, forcing animation within humanity or within humans. It links what is observable to something that is not observable, which is the observable body, giving life to what is not observable, which is supposed to be inside of the human body, the essence of life, the essence of soul. Go to the Hebrew tradition now, the life-giving breath. Now, this is still a central motif. God breathes breath into the nostrils of Adam. The act serves as a metaphor for divine life, forcing the animation of human or forcing the animation of humanity. And it connects the physical act of breathing to the very profound mystery of life and soul, as it is the same in the Egyptian religion. So I have this here side by side just to show that these elements, they're the same. Same elements, same imagery used, same elements maintained, same purpose, same intention. Ultimately, not to be taken literally, but for this very purpose, for reviewing what is supposed to be an aspect of life within life on a surface level. When you get to the Genesis part of it, philosophical comes later once you understand how the authors are working their narrative into their philosophical context. And what they're doing also is mixing what is supposed to be sacred with what is thought to be profane, and that's us, humans. The blending of this, and this is still going on the same, logic behind why this illustration of a deity forming something from the ground is relevant. The act is supposed to show that and psychologically also play a role in an individual understanding that even though they themselves may not find themselves to be as worthy or worth anything, there is a deity that finds worth in you because he created you with his own thoughts, feelings, and actions intimately, personally. So this is supposed to again cause one to understand that they hold a specific and special role as a person that is sacred, and that every person has a sacred role being alive. And this sort of just reinforces belief and personality within belief. and personability of experience, because everything is not simply just as grounded and physical and earthly as it may seem. There is quote unquote divine agency behind what is called quote unquote human and the destiny of it. Now, Khnum's narrative highlights ongoing creative activity and craftsmanship. Just comparing these two narratives cognitively, humans are portrayed as part of a continuous divine process. The potter metaphor emphasizes the artisan-like role of that particular deity, which ultimately reflects a worldview of one's involvement with creation while being a part of creation, and also one's involvement with their deity's heart and mind and actions, while also playing a part themselves in their deity's heart, mind, and actions. Now, the uniqueness behind the Genesis creation is that the human is at the center of everything. Humans are still at the center of everything in the Egyptian mythology, but it's not as completely personal because it's not just humans that are created on this potter's wheel, right? It's also gods. Here, it's really personal. It's just humans that are created by their deity, meaning that there is a special relationship that the deity has with human beings through not just the formation, but also the giving of breath to them. The responsibility of what it means to then have that breath within you and to continue in a way that reflects respect for the breath that has been given to you. This also presents a worldview where humanity is the love of their deity, the center of their deity. The human holds the heart of their deity, so much so that it is impossible to even probably fathom the kind of care it takes for a supreme deity to take the time to form something and then to breathe themselves into it. It's a personal act. It's a very personal act that speaks to one's continued involvement with both where they are born to, which is earth, and who they are born from, which is their deity. Now, there is a challenge philosophically and culturally and linguistically to all of this. And it stems from the fact that Genesis 2:7 itself comes from Egyptian mythology. And the fact that it comes from Egyptian mythology, even though all of this uniqueness is there, and that's really great, but it comes from Egyptian mythology and it sort of cancels out the uniqueness once you factor that in. It's no longer original, it's no longer influential, and it's really no longer appropriate culturally because it is a shared now ideology that originated in Egypt from myth. So this isn't any longer something to trust in. It's coming from myth, it's being rehashed and recycled. This really places a weight, not necessarily on the text itself, even though on the surface it may seem that way. It places a weight on what we hold to be tradition, religious tradition. It holds a weight on what we assume to believe the scriptures are saying, despite it never once ever saying anything about human beings. It raises thought for questioning why we even got to this point of allowing something to tell us something that's really not there, but is actually originating in another mythology and from another god of a pantheon mix of other gods and deities. So all of this has really profound implications that we should be thinking about. And again, as I always like to say, for the purpose of the growth and the development of our personal devotional conversation. Because we have to know these things. We have to know these things because it only adds logic, rationale, and affection to our beliefs intellect to be able to guide itself into the direction that it needs to be guided into for the kind of experience that we individually know that we should be having with these things. So there is a process of waking up and understanding that culture, as here implied, is not culture as here or as should be intended. What is implied is not really that much intended for the individual devotional conversations experience. We have to realize this. And we can only realize this, and the reason I'm doing this presentation is for the sake of understanding origin. We have to understand origin. We have to understand origin because only then will we be able to have a pretty good vision of where we expect or where we intend our devotional experience to go. And so there is a call and there is a need for dialogue and for reflection. Because even though that, we have these ideas and these thoughts about these things, when we're understanding where these things come from, we need to begin to reflect on our own belief aside from religious tradition, because we like to walk around and say that we're not this denomination, I'm not that denomination, I don't do this, I don't do that, but you're still subscribing to the base tenets of it. You're still subscribing. That means the intellect of the belief has not reached any higher than the very base and low fundamental institutionalized understanding that it has been given. So we need to have a dialogue about these things, not necessarily with one another, but also inwardly, because the commonalities can't, within these things, be ignored. The commonalities between the Egyptian mythology, Khnum forming man from the ground on his potter's wheel, and then Genesis 2:7, that deity forming man from the dust of the ground and eventually taking on the role of a potter or assigning to himself a self-appointed as a self-appointed potter of the priesthood, never of humans. We have to really look at these things, and then we have to really be able to see how these things are playing a role on our belief. So just to conclude, very sensitive issue, right? Very sensitive issue. Every time I bring out the topic and then I actually show that the Genesis creation of Adam is not a Genesis creation of a first man, of a literal man. And then when you factor in that there is a mythology that originates this, that, and it gets heavy when we think that our belief isn't really what it is, or but we really have to just see it. You can't unsee this. And when we're looking for what is real, when we're looking for a real experience, we have to be able to pinpoint what is not. And the only way to do that is to prune and purge and go through that coarse ground as this is, because every time I bring this subject up, there is a feeling that there is something that's not right with what I am articulating. And seeing this, and I've dealt with this from a philosophical perspective for the past 2 years. Seeing now this, doing this presentation, bringing in the mythology that actually verifies the scene there. It is this deity that the author writing and scripting that scene in Genesis is thinking of. It is Khnum that is creating man from the dust of the ground. Even though they are renaming their deity another deity other than Khnum, this God is on their mind. And even though they're using this God and that God is on their mind, even though they're using the very same lingo, very same scene, very same outcome, very same philosophical principle, very same theological agenda, everything's the same. Nothing's different. They're not yet exactly using the same deity. They're not using, in a sense, any deity at all. It is a figurative illustration for the cycle that the author is and does experience throughout the history of their people and what they believe will be a continued repetition for their people and specifically their priesthood of how their deity reacts to them and will continue. So, seeing these shared similarities between the creation story of man in Genesis and then seeing Khnum, the original God that formed man from the dust of the ground. Well, we have to be able to see this and really understand where the belief is coming from, and then make a distinction between where the belief is coming from and where we intend our belief to go. Very great difference here. And So seeing, well, then that takes us into a realm where we can take greater accountability for the growth and for the development of our devotional conversation.